Sooner or later on the spiritual journey, we are called to explore death. In this episode of Into the Mystery, we will examine physical death, ego death, and the prominent role that death plays as an ally to our awakening, as an ally to truly living.
You want to talk about death?
Let's talk about death.
Let's talk about death.
I can't wait.
I don't know how that's going to go.
Talk about death. I'm one of the few people who can talk all day long, just about every day, about death.
Can you? Okay. Well, what's the first thing you would say about
Well, I
it?
remember I had a couple weeks ago, I met with someone for lunch, and they were saying that they'd brought a friend to yoga, and I spent the whole time reminding folks that we're going to die and this is all temporary. And the gal left feeling pretty depressed afterwards. We don't like to talk about it. To be reminded of our mortality, to be reminded that all of what we know and love and cherish vanishes. This is not a comforting subject.
No, not at all. In fact, it's something we actively avoid. It's not just because we kind of don't want to deal with it because it's uncomfortable, because there's almost a taboo, at least in Western society. And not only do we not want to talk about it, but we go to such extraordinary lengths to prevent it. I'm thinking of people who become ill. You remember the case of Terry Schiavo. I think that was back in the 90s. She was a Florida woman who I forget what her illness was, but she had been in a coma for years and years, and her husband felt that her wish would have been to be disconnected and allowed to pass. And I think her parents were convinced that because every once in a while she would have these spontaneous muscle movements or something, that it meant that there was still consciousness locked in there. And so they were waiting for a cure or for some kind of therapy to bring her back. And anyway, it became a big political grandstanding opportunity. And so it was in the media for a while. At any rate, she finally was allowed to die. And I think that sort of points to an idea that I'm familiar with from my Catholic upbringing, that all life is precious and that you are not to end it prematurely under any circumstances, no matter how much the individual is suffering. And I think that's, I don't even know how to think about that, whether it's misguided but it speaks to me as like not really being a reverence for the cycle of life, the cycle of existence and creation and destruction. It's just kind of this desperate holding on.
Patanjali speaks of the 5 kleshas, the 5 obstacles, the 5 hindrances, and abhinivesha is that final one he mentions in describing the fear of death, the clinging to the body. It's our most primal impulse. It's our most, well, not impulse. It's our deepest instinct to preserve the health and safety of the body. And, we turn that into an art form. We turn it into an obsession that, because the basic belief within all of us is I am a body. And when the body goes, I vanish. I am no more. And when we speak of self-realization, we speak of an antidote to death, because we speak about realizing what doesn't come and go, what doesn't die. But as long as we are housed within an awareness that we are our body, we are our personality, there's always going to be this fear of death, which means there's always going to be some defense from it, some hiding from it, some need to escape it and run from it. And, when I was in India, it was quite remarkable how close the Indian people live to death in certain places. Whereas in Western civilization, it's hidden from us in every level. Every level possible, it's hidden from us.
Yeah. I was about to make a similar point about Mexico. One thing that I've noticed being here, Mexicans, at least in my observation, tend to be a little bit more fatalistic than Americans, who assume that they can manage everything and control, the course of their lives and deaths even. Whereas here in Mexico, like in India, as you describe it, death tends to be more immediate. The roads are poorer and the society in general is a little bit poorer. And if you are over the age of 60 and die, they won't even do an autopsy on you generally, unless there's some reason to suspect an unnatural death, because it's just the age at which people start to die here. And the newspapers will print photos of gory car accidents, or if there's a shooting or something, like they will go ahead and just print the photo of that without blurring it, without warning you. It's kind of in your face in the way that it's not in the US, because we
Hmm.
tend to be just so kind of sensitive about people's feelings around death.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I found that a little shocking at first when I started to visit down here, but after a while I thought, it's more honest. It's a much more
Yeah.
honest way of encountering our emotions around things, rather than kind of maintaining this aura of invincibility and sort of adding to the sense of tragedy when that goes horribly wrong and someone does die. There, because you've built up this expectation that life just goes on, and suddenly that's disrupted, and it actually increases our suffering, I think, if we don't come to terms with that.
Yeah. Well, we can see how much investment there is in our, not only our personal lives, but in society, in insulating ourselves from the
Mhm.
discomfort, the fear
Yeah.
of death, the ugliness of death, the decay that's
Mhm.
present. And that insulation is, we regard it as something that serves us when in fact it doesn't at all.
Right. Right, it just postpones our discomfort
Hmm. Yep. It's a buffer.
until such time as we have no choice but to deal with it. And we kind of delude it's funny the ways we delude ourselves into thinking it's never going to come for us, as we get
Yeah.
older, and, there's all kinds of ways to preserve the body now that,
Yeah.
can sort of trick your mind into thinking, "Oh, I'm not old yet, this is never gonna happen to me. I'm just gonna
Yeah.
be 35 forever," or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah.
And it's so delusional, and we know it is. That's
Yeah.
just the funny thing about it, is we know that this is not really the right way to go about it, and yet we do it anyway because we have this sort of
Hmm.
cultural obsession with youth and self-preservation. I actually met a guy, who was in his 50s and was researching some sort of life extension technology that he thought was gonna keep him alive till 250 or later, and I thought, "Well, okay, but, like, wouldn't you just rather die and start over in a new body?"
Well, most of us are trying to prevent death without even ever having lived.
Oh, that's an excellent point.
Because in one sense, just a moment of real living, real contact with the heart and core of love and meaning and life is enough to satisfy us against this fear of death. And yet we spend so much of our life energy refusing to die rather than being willing to live, and
Oh, that's yeah.
it's so observable that we're not really afraid of death. We're afraid of living,
Yeah,
because to live truly, in a sense, is to die to all that we thought we were and all that we thought was important and all that we thought was real.
right. And to open yourself completely to the experience of living in any given moment. You can't do that if you're simultaneously trying to protect your safety at all times. If you're trying to keep yourself
Right.
insulated from any, danger that might or might not be coming at you, there's no surrender. There's no surrender to
Hmm.
life.
Hmm.
And I agree with you. What you'll find after you've learned uh, to truly surrender to an experience, or whatever it is, whether it's pleasurable or painful, or somewhere in between, if it's sheer boredom, that is the real fabric of life, of a life experience. That once you touch that, as you said, you mentioned to me one time that I think it was Gangaji, one of your teachers had said to you that, if I never see another sunset, it'll be okay.
Hmm.
I think that kind of encapsulates it, is to plunge deeply into something so that you almost become it, is a way of absorbing that experience into your soul in such a way that you don't need to go chasing it again, or
Yeah.
you don't need to go
Yeah.
chasing something better and higher every time, because
Yep.
you already contain it, and you
Yes.
intuitively know that.
Yeah. To live with such intensity and intimacy that there's nothing left undone.
Yeah.
I when I was with my first teacher, David Medicine Man, he occasionally I would ask him, "How are you doing?" And occasionally he would respond, "Hoka hey," which
Mhm.
he told me meant today is a good day to die.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
that's what we can say when we've lived fully. And from the reason we fear death is because we know somehow that we haven't lived yet.
Yeah. Yeah, like, it's too soon. I can't go yet because
Yeah,
I haven't done X, Y,
right.
and Z. I actually had an experience like that in my 20s when I was, managing a restaurant, and a gunman came in and robbed me, locked me in a freezer. I don't know if I told you this story, but I had
No,
a
I
gun
haven't
held
heard
to my
this one.
head. Yeah, so I won't go through the whole story, but for a period of about 20 minutes, I thought it was the end, and that was my big complaint in my head was, "I haven't done everything yet." I haven't
Ah,
experienced these
yeah.
things. I'm 27 years old or whatever it was, and you can't take me yet.
Yes. Hmm. Wow.
And it changed the course of my life. Like, I had thought at that point in my life that I was never going to have children, but I subsequently
Hmm.
went ahead and did that anyway, and some other things. So on the one hand, I embraced risk after that in a lot of ways. I became a
Hmm.
lot less afraid of myself and a lot less afraid of the world around me because I knew it could all change in an instant. Um, but it also made me really neurotic in a lot of ways that we don't have time to describe here. But I think I just want to say that having confronted the reality of death in such a way does kind of make life more vivid after that. I mean, I
Hmm.
can recall
Hmm.
staring at birds on a lawn and just being moved to tears because I was able to
Yeah.
still see those things. And you don't
Yeah.
get that if you're just holed up in your house all the time trying to avoid danger.
You brought to mind as you were sharing, um, I had a similar teaching. It was different, but when I was 10 years old, my grandmother, who I'd been very close with, had a brain aneurysm,
Mm,
and after that, spent the rest of her life incapacitated. And she had worked so hard in her life and gave herself so little room to enjoy, to
mm,
live. And it was so sad because after finally retiring in her 60s, she had decided to go visit her sister in Arizona, which she had never done. And she was so excited for it. And we showed up the night before to visit her and say goodbye. And we found her,
mhm,
not too far from death. And it was a huge teaching as a 10-year-old because what was spoken of was, it's such a shame. It's such a shame, but that she worked so hard and that she struggled so much,
mm,
and that now that she had this gift to be able to live somewhat, it was gone. And
mhm.
I remember as a 10-year-old vowing to myself, I'm never going to live that kind of life. I'm never going to live stuck in, a job where, the idea is when I'm 60 something, I'll be able to live.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
and how much we do, we postpone life for when I have fill in the blank.
Yeah, and you make very different choices when that's not your orientation.
Right. I like the way you're saying.
And maybe it was my having this experience in my 20s and subsequently, years later, this experience of almost dying of an illness that reinforced the idea that you can take risks and experience things that are not conventional in your life, and it probably won't kill you. I mean, something else might, but there's no law written that says you have to work in an office 9 to 5, 40 hours a week your whole life and never experience anything until, like you said, it's time to retire and you've got your nest egg and let's go on a cruise or something. That's a safe way to live. And there's nothing wrong with it if that's the way you
Yeah.
choose, to go about your life. But there's so many other options and so many other ways to
Yeah.
just dive headfirst into things that you wouldn't have experienced otherwise.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. There's so many ways to die that seem like life. And
Mm,
it's, to me, we're turning the bend, and to me we're beginning to address something else besides death now, which is, what is it to live?
mhm.
What is it to live? Really? Really, what is it to live truly, fully?
What is it to discard the narratives that tell you what it is to live and then
Ah.
find your own way in the world
Mm-hmm.
such that dying becomes an acceptable risk
Yeah.
as long as you're, following a path that's satisfying. And what is satisfaction? What do we need?
Mm-hmm. Yes. What is life? What is it to be life, like in the way when Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. What is it to be as we really are? What is it to be crucified within everything that we have created, and to resurrect ourselves within a true form of life, a true life,
Mm.
true living?
Ooh, you just sent a chill through my body when you said that. That's what it is, right? I mean, we have
Mm-hmm.
expectations that we have applied to ourselves, and there is a point where you
Mm-hmm.
make that transition from sort of living, going through the motions to really embracing, really making love to life, and you have to go through
Uh,
that dying, that putting yourself and your whole self-concept up on the cross, and I don't mean this in any way to dishonor Jesus, I hope it doesn't sound that way, but, to just feel that suffering and then let it go, and then free fall into whatever comes next. Was that blasphemous?
sure, it's blasphemous, but there we can be blasphemous
Oh,
here.
good.
We're not. We're not. We're not tied to any punishment schemes.
Alright, good.
I don't think. But your story reminded me of, after being held up at gunpoint, it reminded me, I think it was Terence McKenna. I remember sharing a story about, I think he had a brain tumor, and had gotten to the point where I think it was no longer treatable, and spent an afternoon on a park bench, and I think he saw an ant carrying just a little tiny bit of leaf.
Mm,
And he said it was enough to just send him into the deepest kind of ecstasy, and tears were streaming down his eyes. And it was evident that when all the filters were removed, when there was no hope of continuation, no hope of maybe living tomorrow as a possibility,
mhm.
no postponement, it was like the richness of life was there in such full vibrancy. And I think
Yeah.
we crave that without even knowing that we crave it.
Mhm.
It's we crave that intensity and intimacy of life so deeply, and we long for it and don't even know that we're longing for it.
When I had the gun to my head, everything superficial evaporated. There was nothing. My brain completely stopped in that moment, or those moments. And I mean, in a way, I suppose it was an ego death because I was just simply awareness in this moment, waiting to see what happened. I was on my knees. He had a gun to the back of my head. I was looking at concrete, and he was yelling, and I was saying things. And when it was all over, and I was kind of emotionally recovering for weeks afterward, it was that same sort of experience, that clarity that my true nature had been so drowned out by all the distractions around me. And there is a piercing
Mm.
through, or a way that your vision becomes so attuned to the immediacy of life.
I like the way you said that, the immediacy of life.
It's right.
That life is immediate. It's
Yeah.
right here.
It's right there to be grasped, but we're busy drowning it out all the
Hmm.
time, and we're busy using our brains
Yeah.
to create a lot of noise and add, layers and layers of meaning and implications and narratives on top of things, and that's not what it is.
Yeah.
That's not what it is at all, and
Yeah.
when that is removed from your vision, all of a sudden, what's left is just life.
It's as though we're walking through a beautiful garden full of gorgeous flowers and incredible bugs and sweet fragrances, and walking through the garden looking for, well, where's the end? Where's the end of the garden?
Yeah.
Where's the
Where's
destination
the gift
point?
shop?
Right. Where's the gift shop? Right. It's like, I think you're missing the point, my friend. It's like, and that's what, we think of spirituality as all sorts of different things, evolution of consciousness and refinement of body and opening of chakras and all these things. And there's truth to all that. But finally it comes down to the immediacy of
Yeah.
life, right? That if you can't be alert and available to the flower in front of you, or to the boredom you're experiencing, or to the child who's looking into your eyes, or to the pain you feel in your back,
Yeah.
then you're missing the point.
And we can't connect to life that intimately without the contrast of death to sort of put it into sharp relief.
Yeah. Right. That's what it means to live with death as an ally or a
Yeah.
companion. If you run from death, it's no longer a companion, it's your enemy. You're hiding from it. But when it's your ally, It's there to inform you of the immediacy of life.
I think there's also a way that we can reconceptualize death in our minds as a welcome respite, as a destination that we will embrace happily when it comes for us or when we
Oh,
arrive
death
there.
as silence,
Yeah, because this is a
death as stillness.
death as stillness, death as coming home,
Yeah.
and that it isn't fearful.
This is the interesting thing about death is that we crave the dying experience. We crave it through our adventures, we crave it through our entertainment, we crave it through our pleasures, where you have an opportunity to lose yourself.
Mm,
And it's the most joyous, peaceful thing we know in this life. And yet we run from death as though it's something different than that.
yeah.
But to embrace death as peace, to embrace it as the bliss of silence, the bliss of stillness, what could be wrong with that?
And to have that awaiting you at the end of this life experience frees us up to release the demands of the narratives and the culture and all the things around us, because ultimately those things will add up to nothing anyway. And so, why wouldn't you commit to this moment and dive in as deeply as possible?
Hmm. Yes. So you bring in another very important point, which is that with death as an ally, with the immediacy of life, we also recognize what is valuable, what is meaningful.
Yes, very much so.
That's a great point.
I love the fact that you brought up bugs because I love looking at nature photos and, the macroscopic ones where you're looking at, I don't know, like a ladybug or something very tiny and noticing what beautiful art there is on that level of experience. As humans, we're large kind of relative to everything else.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and meanwhile, these beautiful things are dying all around us at this macro level. And yet, while they're alive, they're such exquisite little specimens of the creativity of God. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and, that's just one more thing that you can begin to encounter when you get out of taking your own life so seriously and look at the fact that you're all life,
Yeah.
and that life exists on all these different levels.
Yeah.
There are all these journeys that we can take.
Yes. To experience the life through the contact with the bug or the flower or the. It's funny you mentioned bugs because just the other day I had a phone call with a friend of mine who's a mystic, and it was such a sweet and simple phone call. It only lasted maybe 10 minutes. A good portion of that conversation was just trying to decide if what she was seeing was a weevil or a tick.
Oh,
And we she shared a couple. I thought I've known a few ticks in my day, so I thought maybe I could handle that question. So she sent me a picture, and this is very unmystical that we're sharing pictures of ticks or weevils and trying to decide if it needed to die or not. And there was this, but there was something in it also that was just so simply profound in that here we are with God in our awareness, just having the most delightful little exchange about weevils and ticks.
yeah. Well, I mean, not all to live a great life doesn't mean that you have to achieve some, I don't know, stature as a career person or
Uh-oh.
stardom, or it's those tiny little moments. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, and this is just such conventional wisdom anyway,
Yeah.
but it's true.
Yes. Well, it's something that we as American or Western civilization need to hear deeply because our narcissism and our vanity keep us striving for greatness, missing the greatness that is around us all the time.
Yeah, and that reminds me of something I wanted to say earlier, which is that our attachment to narrative, like we come into adulthood thinking, oh, I'm going to make something of myself. I'm going to be somebody in the world, and I'm going to create this ego that will be recognized and maybe attain great fame or something. And not only do we want to do this while we're alive, but we want to somehow extend that into the future indefinitely and be a great
Sure. Well,
person.
if you can build a great tower with your name on it, then you live on.
Yes.
If you can have a statue made, a book published, you live on.
Yeah.
And yet, how long? 1,000 years?
Hmm.
2,000 years? 5,000 years? How long? Right?
Ultimately, it all dissolves,
Yeah.
the universe itself.
But what doesn't dissolve is that immediacy of life,
Right.
the beauty of a night of diamond like stars and a black blanketed sky.
Ah. the graze of a fingertip against the hollow of a throat.
All those precious glimpses of life, and yet impossible without this knowledge and intimate dance with death.
Mm. When we talk about death, we're usually referring to the end of the viability of the physical body. But there are other kinds of death that we experience all the time that I think deserve to be mentioned here as well. And one of them, of course, is what we all encounter on this path, which is the death of the ego, which in my mind can almost be a more frightening thing than contemplating the death of the physical body. I mean, I think in terms of thinking about the body dying, most of us kind of compartmentalize it and think of it, we dilute the sting of it in a way because we think of it as a way of just kind of going to sleep and not waking up again. And there's a certain comfort in that because we go to sleep all the time and we're not afraid of that, or maybe we go under anesthesia, something like that. So that's an experience that's familiar and we can kind of assign death to that and at least temporarily feel good about that. But when the ego begins to die, that begins to take away things that we rely on when we think about who we are. It's almost a more intense form of death, I think, if you're really encountering it directly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and my first experience that even started me toward this path on towards self-realization was based in a dying experience. And what was so evident in that experience was that the only thing that dies is the imagined separate self.
Mm,
And of course, well, let's concede that the body dies, of course, but the idea that who we essentially are dies is, you could say, it's one of our primary errors. It's like the deepest mistake in our consciousness to think that what we are really at our core can die. And as soon as we begin to believe that we can die, there's a fear of non-existence, and there is a deep fear of the unknown, what lies
mhm.
beyond that. But it
Yeah.
was so remarkable in my experience when I could see that Paul and all that I thought Paul to be vanished, and yet there was something which remained. And it became
Mm,
clear to me that death is completely misunderstood by our mind, that it's not associated just with the body, but it's this notion of this false center, this false separate self, and its possibility of dying, which, because it's what we believe ourselves to be, it seems like when that goes, everything else goes, that there's
mhm.
nothing left.
Yeah. I had not a dying experience, but maybe a similar disconnecting from my imagined self in a lucid dream that I have described to you before, where I was in what seemed to be in the dream a parallel reality, and I began testing that reality by touching things and feeling them because I was aware that something was off, but I really thought that I was in default reality. And I was unable to find any difference between that reality and the one I subsequently woke back up into here. And in that transition, it was absolutely clear to me that my consciousness can localize itself anywhere, in any dimension, in any sort of a reality, and that I am not tethered to this one. And whether this one was more real than that one or vice versa, I don't know, and it doesn't really matter. But the idea that consciousness is fluid and that it is not ultimately identified with any particular physical form really kind of hit home for me. There was definitely an unsettling aftermath to that as far as the way I experienced myself, but it also felt very freeing. I mean, the idea that
Mm-hmm.
your consciousness will just flow somewhere else and reconstitute itself or not, you know?
Well, there's a couple of levels there that you're articulating that I think would be good for us to extrapolate. You remind me of Chong-Tzu. You've heard this one about Chong-Tzu has a dream that he's a butterfly and
No,
wakes up
no.
and thinks, am I Chong-Tzu dreaming of being a butterfly, or am I a butterfly dreaming of being Chong-Tzu? And but there's something here too. The yogic path speaks of four states, and it speaks of waking, dream, deep sleep, and then it speaks of the fourth state, turiya,
Mhm.
which is that all-encompassing consciousness which holds all the other three, right? So
Yes.
we can have this experience of living in different realities. I mean, we can have one reality at 9 a.m. and a totally different one at 12 p.m.
Mhm.
And we wonder which one's real. You know, we can be depressed at 9 a.m. and elated by noon for some reason based on how our circumstances change. You know, so even in that, we see that there's these deaths of states, deaths of
Yeah.
experience, deaths of
Mhm.
what these apparent realities seem to be. And yet there is presence and the consciousness that remain always throughout all of them.
And when we talk about death of the ego, what we're really discussing, or what we're really alluding to, is it's the death of our narratives, it's the death of our anchors in time or to people or to certain aspects of ourselves that we've relied on. It's the death or the end of our goals, maybe, our grievances, our delusions. And all of those things put back together, are essentially what we thought of as quote unquote me or quote unquote I. When we're talking about death of the ego, would you agree that what we're then confronting is the abyss that we speak about?
In the death of the ego,
Yeah.
well, I would say that at the core of every ego is a black hole, an
Mm,
abyss, a deep emptiness, which is not to me the final story of who we are,
right.
but it is at the core of the ego because I look at the ego somewhat like a donut where it's got its substance, but at its core it's nothing. There's
Mm,
nothing there. It's hollow, it's
mhm.
empty. And so to face ego death, in my experience, absolutely entails facing the abyss, facing the void and the nothingness that is at the core of our ego,
Yeah.
which we ordinarily experience as a deep sense of deficiency and inadequacy, because an inherent knowing within egoic consciousness that as an ego, what I am isn't real, that it has no substance. And so we experience that on an emotional level as a sense of deficiency, inadequacy. I'm not enough. I'm not significant, because at the core of the ego, those things are all true.
Mm,
What death entails is passing through the doorway, passing through into the abyss where the ego isn't. Or I shouldn't even say passing through, that would entail an entity that passes through to consciously experience that abyss, to find the core of the ego as empty and nothing is in fact that is ego death.
I'm playing with this thought here of why ego death is so traumatic. Why it's something that I realize that there are people who occasionally, and it's pretty rare in my understanding, will have such type of an awakening where the ego immediately vanishes. But for most of us, it's more of a, drips and drabs kind of a thing where pieces of the ego, we become aware of them over time and then must dissolve them individually. And there's a lot of disorientation and fear around that. And I'm trying to maybe articulate that particular fear because we do end up, looking at the abyss in the middle of the donut of the ego, versus the fear of the physical dissolution of the body. Or am I just way out there?
Well, no, I think you have some relevant points here. I think it's not ego death that is so terrifying, it's the resistance that we put up to it. In one
Mm,
sense, like we said in our ego episode, that in one sense you could look at the ego as a set of resistances and defenses, and
mhm.
those defenses of the ego, the false self, are constructed to avoid this inner core of emptiness, this inner core of non-substance.
Ah,
And
okay.
so along the way to discovering the non-substance of our ego, the hole in the center of the donut, there's a great deal of resistance that is placed. And even for one who has an experience of ego death, there are still the emotional and energetic residues of that false self that will have to be cleared, purified, released
Mhm.
in order for that full expression of our divine nature to be lived and known. Even
Yeah.
in the case of someone who experiences an instantaneous ego death, I've never heard of an example of anybody who didn't undergo a sadhana following their ego
Mhm.
death experience, their awakening
So
experience.
there's always that integration period regardless of the intensity of your initial,
Well, I would say it
experience.
happens one in two ways. Either a person goes through gradual purification and then has the experience of ego death and self realization, or they have an experience of self realization, and the sadhana and path that follows is one of gradual dissolution. But I would say I've never encountered a story anywhere of someone who had a sudden experience of self realization and it was absolutely stabilized.
Mhm,
I mean, it's posited with Jesus. I'm not certain of that. I can sense that it's probably true.
mhm,
And of course, I never met Jesus in the flesh.
right. Just as in the death of the physical body, when the ego dies, there is similarly a grieving period because we really are saying goodbye to ourselves as though the person that I thought that I was, has left the building.
Well, I'd say the grieving period is part of those residues because if we really realize what ego death means, there's nothing to grieve for. Nothing's been lost.
From an awakened standpoint, sure, but I mean from the standpoint of someone who has suddenly had, well, I guess let's say this, that we begin with an ego shock that leads to an ego death. And maybe it's that shock that's so disorienting. The idea that all the
Oh, yeah.
stories that I had made up about myself, all the connections I had made to people, none of these things that I used to define myself, none of those anchors I had in physical reality were actually real.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this still is a problem sometimes is who am I supposed to be now? Or
Well, that's the disorienting part. Yeah. I mean, it's
yeah,
self realization, whether it's minor or major, always has a disorienting component to it. And that tends to produce anxiety in our being. The uncertainty.
but there is also a very real sense that this hologram of myself that I had created has simply walked away. Maybe this is just the way that my mind works with images and things, but it's almost as if this someone stepped out of this body and has left me, and I'm left here with the aftermath.
Well, what's left with the aftermath?
Well, that's a good question. Residue of the ego, I suppose.
I mean, I do understand what you're saying, and I can understand how it's as though what we had acquired and took to be ourself vanishes or leaves.
I think that might be part of what feeds into Dark Night of the Soul, which we should probably do an
Yeah,
episode on.
definitely it does. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, because the dark night of the soul is the soul's traversing that territory of emptiness and desolation. But it's not the final result, of course. It's not what when we say ego death, we are implying not only the process of dying, but also the result.
I do still grieve that old self at times. And maybe it's not the self itself. It's more the certainty that I miss of thinking that I was a thing
Mm,
and this disruption of that illusion
yeah.
coming out of that.
It's what makes it very hard to bear.
Yeah, there's a security, and we attach not just to other humans for our security, but to these ideas about ourselves that we hold so strongly. And you can see that anytime you talk to somebody and you question or somehow, unintentionally threaten some aspect of their identity that they took to be really important, or yeah, or something they're very proud of.
But you lose your center. You lose your center,
Yeah,
and that center provides a false security and ground that we are usually busy maintaining for a sense of a stable self. And that's not a light endeavor. That's why this path of self realization. It's not for the lighthearted. It's not for children. I mean, it's
yeah.
for a person who's really ready to undergo a radical transmutation of their being.
But as with any, I mean, just as with physical death, with an ego death, then something else is made way for. I don't want to say reborn
Uh-huh.
because that would imply an object, but
There is a resurrection. There's a resurrection of what is truly present in our core. That's the whole symbol of the crucifixion is as a personal journey, as a personal experience. That's something that we are recapitulating is that we undergo a voluntary ego death and that leads to a resurrection of the true light of our being.
Death is hard to talk about. I keep self censoring here because I don't want to be flippant about it. But
Mm,
there is something that happens on the spiritual path where it becomes much less of a boogeyman. You know, it's when you know that that's not the end and it's simply a transition, you do sort of start whistling past the graveyard in a way. And I'm really conscious of not wanting to offend someone who has maybe lost someone close. You know what I mean?
mm.
I feel myself tiptoeing around this. And
Well, that's a good, I mean, that's our general attitude toward death is to tiptoe around it.
yeah,
I mean, that's what our mind is scared of it. And we tend to tiptoe around things we're scared of.
it's not death so much that I'm scared of, it's other people's, the magnitude of their response to death that I'm trying to be conscious of here.
Why?
Just because it's such a tricky topic and we never know what to say about it. And
Well, let's just be honest about it.
okay, well, I mentioned my neighbor apparently died the other day, and I keep thinking I should go by and say something, but I don't know how. I don't know if it's appropriate. I mean, it's a rumor still at this point. I haven't seen it confirmed in any real official fashion. And how do you address that? I'd like to be
So that's a
supportive,
good,
but
okay, good. That's a good different position for us to take is like, how do we relate to death? How do we relate to those who are experiencing death? Or how do we relate to those who have lost? And I
yeah,
think, we do so with heart. We do so, I mean, if we can do so with the light of presence, we do so without fear and we
yeah.
do so with total love because we do have this deep association between death and fear and annihilation that makes us, whether it's our own death or another's, it makes us skittish and afraid. But when we proceed forward in presence and in love, we realize there's nothing to fear, that we go
Yeah.
boldly toward it. And we can be there for others in that way, that we can support them to be with their grief, be with their fear, be with their loss, and yet maintain that space of total love and presence.
Because we're all so uncomfortable with the topic, and there's all kinds of opinion pieces you can read online about how to approach a dying person, what to say, what not to say. And I'm the kind of person who just sort of reads these lists and goes, oh my God, I can't possibly be a human and remember all of
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. No, it's very anti human to create a formula.
But, then I think back to when, for example, my brother died and people came up to me and offered me condolences. And I just I had nothing for them. I had no, it's like, yes, he died. And I didn't really need anything. There wasn't anything anybody could have said to
Mhm.
help it. I appreciated someone saying, I'm sorry, but I really didn't want to talk about it. And so I think, because we all have a different way of approaching these things.
I don't think we should worry about offending anybody. I think we should just concern ourselves with approaching with love.
You're absolutely right. So my brother and I were not close at all, not since childhood. We were completely different personalities. We kind of had that bond from growing up in a dysfunctional family. But beyond that, I mean, after high school, we went our separate ways and never encountered each other. But he went through a several-year battle with cancer, which he hid from most of the family. So it was only maybe a couple of months before he died that I kind of got wind of what was happening. And we only spoke every few years, really, under normal circumstances. And yet when he died, my grief was so theatrical and overwhelming that I had to kind of stop myself and question it. Like, what is it that I'm grieving here? What have I lost? I remember some things from childhood, but it's not like he was my closest confidant. It's not like we shared a lot of things in common or had all these experiences that we had enjoyed together. And I came to realize that what I was grieving was some projection of myself I had put on him, aspects of my own story that would not play out as his story because I had this whole story about him that I related to. And now that was over. And somehow that seemed like an affront to me. And I'm just trying to be honest here. I know this sounds really narcissistic, probably, but um,
I think it's actually real. It's what most people probably go through.
I already had an understanding of death as being a transition and not some tragic ending. And I assumed that he was fine and would continue. And yet there was just this upwelling of energy of things that yeah, I just felt like swamped in it, swamped in grief, and it made no sense. Now, from the distance of 7 or 8 years, I can look back on that and say that that's what all that was. It was all these projections of my own ego that I had superimposed onto him, and all these stories of my own that now seem to have been unfairly cut off at this early age that were so upsetting to me. And so I wonder whether our experiences of grief could be mitigated if we better understood them.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, if we were to dive into them a little bit more honestly from a spiritual orientation, psychological
Yeah.
orientation.
Grief's obviously a very complicated subject because there is something that is fundamentally affected in us when we lose someone we love, and the loss of form and all that it meant to us, and what it means in terms of our own form and our own death. But at the core, grief is love.
Mm,
That's all it is
yeah.
at its core. And we grieve for the loss, but that grief is only a symptom of the love. Whenever I work with someone who is experiencing grief, my constant suggestion is be aware of the loss, but to place your consciousness in the love, because in that love, nothing has gone anywhere.
That's good advice.
And I don't mean that in some kind of like metaphysical trip to soothe yourself with. I mean, actually, in
Mm,
love, nothing has gone anywhere.
right.
But grieving is hard. I mean, I love Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's five stages of grieving, and all that we go through. I think they articulate not only what one goes through when they lose someone they love, but it also articulates what we go through in ego death. Same thing.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. I had noticed that, in fact.
Hmm.
Yeah. How does it go? Denial, anger, bargaining. I know acceptance is the final one.
I think it's denial, bargaining, anger, depression, acceptance.
Depression. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Check, check, check.
The depression part of that is the dark night of the soul, if you
Right,
will.
right.
Right. And every ego will go through those stages. It's like at first, it's like the denial of, no, I am this person, and this is who I really am, and this is what my life is really like. And then there's a bargaining period where one tries to negotiate one's own dissolution. And then there's a frustration and absolute anger and rage toward, it's spoken well in Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas. He says, one should not stop searching until one finds. When one finds, one will be enraged. After
Mm.
being enraged, one will be elated. And it sort of articulates that same journey as like when we realize we've been duped, there's
Yes,
this deep anger, and then the deep depression that follows when we realize we've been living a false life,
yes. So much yes.
washing through into acceptance, acceptance that leads to, in this case, self realization. Whether we travel through that with someone we've lost or our own process, it's the same process. It's the
Yeah,
exact same process.
beautifully stated.
And it brings about grace. I think one thing that's really relevant to this conversation on death and ego death is we automatically, in some sense, evoke a conversation about hope, because in the spiritual or religious traditions that teach eternalism, there is a hope that, okay, after I die, whether that's ego death or physical death, there will be something of me that continues.
Yes.
And that provides us with a sense of hope. And I'm not saying that there's not truth, that something in us continues, but I don't know that that hope is all that useful, because it insulates us from
Mhm.
experiencing a real total dissolution
Yeah,
of,
yeah.
of what we thought we were. And, you know, that hope becomes a clinging. I mean, as one of my teachers said, that at a certain point, hope is actually torturous.
We talk about the wave in the ocean, that every human being is simply peak of the wave for a while, and then it dissolves back into the ocean, and then the ocean goes on. And I think combining that awareness with everything I've learned about non-duality and my experiences of non-duality have almost made death, I mean, it's still something that I'm concerned about. I would like to control the circumstances of my death. I'd rather it were not some traumatic event, but the actual reality of facing oblivion and then dissolving into the silence, into the oneness, and reemerging somewhere else. When I get in touch with this understanding, It's almost as though I can immediately flow out of my body and into everything and understand that my consciousness is already everywhere.
Hmm.
And therefore, the dissolution of this particular form of it is, like a hair falling off my head. It's no more significant than that.
Yeah. Well, that's what's revealed in ego death is like the wave that I thought I was vanishes entirely. And yet, because the wave was always only made of the ocean, which we could call consciousness, we could call love, we could call God, we can call it whatever we want, is nothing's died at all.
Yeah,
Nothing has
yeah,
died. It was only the appearance of what I thought I was that died.
right. Why are we so scared of that anyway? Why are we so scared of this winking out, this idea that we can just like poof, be gone?
Because we seem to place our relevance, our significance in being a separate self rather than the all.
Mhm.
When we recognize that we're the all, there's no more, like you said, it's like a hair falling out of your head. Not that any of us should court death or seek it, or it's not a macabre, it's not a masochistic thing that then we run forward into death and
Right,
pain. But
right.
there's a fundamental recognition that there's nothing to fear here. So, and that's what all the teachings talk about is that the attachment to the physical form, the attachment to the flesh, is what reinforces our idea of being a separate self, separate from God, separate from existence. And so it's the very core and essence of our fear of death as well.
What do you think of you've read the Tibetan Book of the Dead? The procedures that are described in there as far as, helping the consciousness eject out of the crown of the head, and
Mhm.
is that something that someone should be concerned with?
When you study the Tibetan Book of the Dead in the traditions, it's not just a ceremonial text that's read upon the death of the physical body. It's actually treated as a sadhana that you work with during your life. And the
Mm,
actual name of the Tibetan Book of the Dead is Bardo Tolos, which means liberation through hearing in the Bardo. And
mhm.
if we want to put that in simple English terms, it means a chance to liberate yourself when there's a space to do so.
Ah.
And right, what the Tibetans are very skilled at, and part of I think that comes from their shamanic bone culture is they have an understanding of the subtlety of mind, which is not located in a physical body. It's played
Right.
out through a physical body, but it's not located in one. So the Tibetans in a sense treat the mind as something that will need healed even after the death of the body,
Mhm.
right? So
Mm,
whether you're
mhm.
working with the Tibetan book in your life or with the idea of after death, the whole possibility is to, in a sense, release attachments to all that you are not, all the things that define you as separate and finite, and all the things that give you a self nature, a self character, so that you can make that return to your oceanic existence clean. And there's almost a sense here, and I think this is reflected in the Christian tradition too, where by purifying your wave, your return to the ocean adds to the ocean.
Ah.
And the Tibetans describe that as like the capacity to consciously reincarnate, but
Mhm.
not as another dirty wave, as purified oceanic,
Mm. Mhm.
awareness.
Yeah.
The teachings in that book are so complex, so we can barely say anything about them here. But
Yeah, I just wanted to point out one facet that kinda leaped out at me, which is that when they speak of the bardo, we think of other bardos as being kind of like a nether region or a purgatory or a
mhm,
span of uncertainty between one thing and another. But
yeah,
in the Book of the Dead, they're talking about life as being the bardo.
well, there are different bardos they speak of. Yeah,
Yeah.
after
Okay.
death, in between two thoughts, during a lifetime, they speak of different. But I like the way you said it because you articulated it really well. It's this space of uncertainty. It's a period that follows chaos or catastrophe. It's where not
Mm.
everything is established in clarity and structure. It
Mhm.
represents a possibility for a change or transformation.
Yeah, and strictly speaking, bardo is where we naturally dwell
Yeah,
as consciousness, in silence, in possibility.
in a sense. In one sense, we could look at it as a pattern that underlies the fabric of material existence. It's like a waiting potential for uncertainty and chaos.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's what we fear. That's what we
Uh-huh.
fear when we fear death. We fear that pending uncertainty and chaos.
Exactly. Because we're so committed to clinging to things, to attaching ourselves to things that feel safe. And death is the ultimate release of all of that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Many times I myself, and I've guided people into a space where they felt, like not just imagined, but felt as though they were existing in a wide open black space, as if in outer space, with nothing they could see, nothing they could hold on to, nothing they could grasp, even as a feeling. Nothing was tangible. And these experiences are available to us when we refine our consciousness to experience them. In other words, we have these possibilities to enter
Yeah.
that gap, that potential space for a deep revelation.
Okay, this is totally kind of on a tangent, but I was in a yoga nidra class one time and dropped into such a space where, my body had disappeared and it was just, me as this point of consciousness in inky blackness. And it was peaceful and calm and perhaps warm and loving in a way, that was pretty subtle. But I remember, to the extent that I thought at all, I just recognized that, oh, so this must be what it's like to be dead. This is okay. My next thought was, but how will I entertain myself? What is there to do here?
I guess you'll come back and play the game all over again, won't you?
I guess I would have to.
Well, that's why the Buddhist tradition, they tease. I say tease lightly, but they tease about desire being the cause of reincarnation, in the sense that you can taste, as you're describing here in your own revelation, you can taste the absolute peace, the love
Yeah,
that is present in the dissolution of self, and yet there's almost this pull to entertain oneself by creating
yeah.
what, difficulty, struggle, suffering, and you know.
Well, hopefully not too much suffering, but there's just that sense of possibility that wants to be satisfied, that need for some kind of a creation to arise out of it, that state can't be eternal, even if it ultimately is. Adyashanti has a beautiful poem about this. Something like, why does anything exist? Because emptiness dances, because it endlessly gives birth.
Yeah, it's a nice way of phrasing it. Yeah.
Because ultimately it's energy. Your consciousness is energy. And so that state of nothingness, while necessary to counterbalance the state of manifestation and form, it needs to be answered with something.
And that's what the Tibetan Book of the Dead sort of works with in the more esoteric sense, is that there's a way of that dissolution of self into the pure space of emptiness, and the way in which something dynamic can come forward that is not a repetition of the past. Because what most of
Yes.
us do is that in encountering that space, we regather, we recollect ourselves, we reify ourselves so as to maintain some semblance of familiarity with who we think we are.
Yes.
But there's a brand new potential that's born out of that space that we are to merge our consciousness with.
Ah,
It's not unlike what the Christian mystics called the cloud of unknowing, this passing through this, almost like a purgatory, a state of absolute uncertainty, in order to achieve unification with God. And that
mm,
unification is dynamic. It does give birth, but it gives birth to something new, not a repetition of the old.
yeah. God just riffs on itself over and over and over again.
The ocean can churn in infinite ways.
Yeah. Anything else, or should I read my poem? Or
Well, everything else, but that's enough for now.
so today I have a poem from Khalil Gibran. This is from the Prophet, and in the Prophet's name is Al Mustafa, and he's surrounded by followers who are asking him questions about things. So that's the context for this passage called On Death. Then Al Mitra spoke, saying, "We would ask now of death." And he said, "You would know the secret of death. But how shall you find it unless you seek it in the heart of life? The owl whose night bound eyes are blind unto the day cannot unveil the mystery of light. If you would indeed behold the spirit of death, open your heart wide unto the body of life, for life and death are one, even as the river and the sea are one. In the depth of your hopes and desires lies your silent knowledge of the beyond. And like seeds dreaming beneath the snow, your heart dreams of spring. Trust the dreams, for in them is hidden the gate to eternity. Your fear of death is but the trembling of the shepherd when he stands before the king, whose hand is to be laid upon him in honor. Is the shepherd not joyful beneath his trembling that he shall wear the mark of the king? Yet is he not more mindful of his trembling? For what is it to die but to stand naked in the wind and to melt into the sun? And what is it to cease breathing but to free the breath from its restless tides, that it may rise and expand and seek God unencumbered? Only when you drink from the river of silence shall you indeed sing. And when you have reached the mountaintop, then you shall begin to climb. And when the earth shall claim your limbs, then shall you truly dance.
Ah, yes.
Pretty good, huh?
Oh, yes. Yes. About as well as it can possibly be said. Thanks for listening to this episode of Into the Mystery. We hope you gained something useful. If you'd like to learn more about our work, you can go to our websites. Mine is at adivajra.org, adivajra.org, or visit Rishika's at interdimensionalyoga.com. If you have questions or topics you'd like to hear about in future episodes, be sure to drop us a line. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening.